Welcome to Pandemic Apparel. This is an updated seam tutorial. These are the following stitches that will be covered in this tutorial: a quarter, a half, and 3/4 seam allowance, plain seam, 1/2 inch overlock, 3/4 overlock, welt seam with a double needle top stitch, flat filled, French, bound, and slot seam. All of these will be done in stages. First, I'll use the single needle, then I'll press the seams, and finally I'll use the overlock machine to finish the raw edges. 1/4 inch seam. Normally one would have 2 pieces of fabric with a notch located a 1/4 inch from the cut edge of the fabric. In this case, I have a long strip of fabric with a notch, 1/2 inch apart on either side of the fabric. Line up the notches and sew using the edge of the presser foot or the sewing machine plate as a guide. 1/2 inch seam will be the same as the 1/4 inch seam, except this time you'll line up the fabric on the 1/2 inch mark of the sewing machine plate, and the notches are 1 inch apart. Most commonly used seam for industrial sewing. 3/4 inch seam will be the same as the 1/4 and 1/2 inch seam. This time line up the fabric on the 3/4 inch mark of the plate. The notches are 1.5 inches apart. This seam is mainly used with zippers, the exception being the invisible zipper, which is sewn with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Plain seam. So 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. The notches are 1.25 inches apart. Once you finish sewing, press the seams open. Then turn the raw edge under 1/8 of an inch and sew along the fold. This is a simple seam, but a useful one to prevent fraying. 1/2 inch overlock. This is the same as the 1/2 inch seam allowance, except this time you'll finish the raw edge with an overlock machine, aka serger. 3/4 inch open overlock. Use 3/4 of an inch seam allowance. Press the seams open and serge. Keep watching and you'll see me demo the step later on. Welt seam with a double needle top stitch is sewn with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After sewing the seam allowance, press it to one side. Top stitch sewing along the seam line using the inside of the presser foot as a guide. Then sew another top stitch, this time using the outside of the presser foot as a guide along the first stitch line. This stitch is commonly found in sportswear, blouses, and yokes, etc. Pressing. Press all seams to one side, except the open seams. Make sure they're pressed to open. When you use an overlock machine, you want the needle thread to be facing you when you turn the garment inside out. When you're finished sewing, make sure to continue sewing so that you have a long chain stitch. Then cut the thread as you see here. You can clearly see the difference between the top and bottom. Also, when you sew with an overlock, line the raw edges to the blade without cutting any of the fabric. Flat filled seam. Use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then press the seam allowance to one side and fold the raw edge to the seam line and use the fingers to crease the fabric. This will give you a guide when you're cutting the seam. The other seam will be wrapped around this one and will be secured with a top stitch. The top stitch is done by sewing along the fold using the inside of the presser foot as the guide. This is another sportswear seam commonly found in skirts, casual, slacks, and blouses. French seam. You'll start sewing the seam with the wrong sides together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Trim down the seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch, then place the right sides of the fabric together and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Bound seam is similar to the clean seam, except you'll use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and sew the bias binding to the raw edge of the seam. If you're using a bias tape purchased from the store, you'll notice that one side is a little bigger than the other. This makes it easier to catch the bias binding underneath while you're sewing from the top. When you're sewing the bias binding from the top, you'll sew along the folded edge and use the inside of the presser foot as a guide. Slot seam. For this slot seam, change the stitch length to a basting stitch and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. But when you cut the thread, only cut the needle thread short and leave the bobbin thread long. It's a lot easier to remove the thread this way later on. Then press the seam allowance open and place the contrast piece of fabric face down. Now sew the contrast piece to the seam allowance using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do this on both sides, then remove the basting stitch. Make sure you stay stitch the ends. Next episode will be drafting a skirt using Lectra. If you missed last episode, Sewing the Maze in Circle, be sure to check that out. And in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to Pandemic Apparel.